Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. As you can see from the title of this video, I'm going to be talking about some books I think would be really good, like film or television adaptations. So for this video, I could have very easily just chosen some of my favorite books or book series and been like, well, these are the ones I want to see the most, which would have been fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I also wanted to keep in mind which of these books or which books would be enticing for a production company. Why would Netflix or Paramount or HBO or whoever want to have these books adapted into their network? I'm not super well versed in the industry, I don't know the ins and outs of it all, so this is just coming from an audience perspective. On top of that, I don't know if any of these books have been optioned or if the rights have been bought or anything like that. I don't really keep track of those types of news because it doesn't really mean anything unless it's actually going into production. So the first book series that I think would be really well adapted for television is The Diviners by Libba Bray. So I love every book on this list that I'm going to be talking about. I've given all of them either 4 or 5 stars, but The Diviners is probably one of my favorite series of all time. This takes place during the 1920s, which I think is already a huge appeal for film or television. Not only does Hollywood, but I also think that other international film industries really like doing era specific period pieces, things like that. This book has a pretty large, diverse cast of characters. I feel with at least the American film industry, we're starting to see more films go the way of large ensemble casts that tend to sometimes be a little bit diverse. We've seen some films and television series with a predominantly marginalized cast of actors do really well, and I think Hollywood's kind of realizing that. So I think something like this would be really enticing for Showtime or something like that. This series follows a cast of characters. In this first book, we follow a young woman named Evie who's been run out of her predominantly evangelical town, and she goes to New York as a punishment, but she's actually really excited to go to New York because who wouldn't be? The reason why she was run out of town is because she has this talent that she only really used as a party trick, but she has this talent where she can read the history of an object by touching it. So that's where the title The Diviners comes in. Also, diviners plural. There's more than one person in this series that has this kind of psychic medium type ability or abilities. Obviously it fits the historical genre, but also there's some kind of horror elements as well. So the next book on my list is Want by Cindy Pon. This is technically a duology, but I haven't read the second book. This book can kind of stand on its own, but definitely some writers could expand on it if they wanted to. This book takes place in a kind of near future setting, so it's definitely sci-fi. This book also takes place in Taipei, so sci-fi, which is something that I feel that Hollywood has always been a little more keen to adapt as opposed to fantasy. Of course, we've had great giants within the industry like Lord of the Rings and recently Game of Thrones, but I think overall we see more sci-fi, less high fantasy. This also has a semi-large cast, which I've already talked about why that would be enticing. I'm thinking that we're going to start to see more and more teen or YA adapted projects. This, however, is probably the least popular book on this list. There's another book that's not as popular, but that's just because it's a new release. This was released in 2017. Didn't get a lot of hype, which is really sad because I think a lot of people would really enjoy this. This is essentially a heist con story. So this takes place in a near distant future where the pollution in major cities has really gone pretty bad. Most people don't really live past 30 or 40 years old because of the illnesses that people get from incredibly polluted air. So almost everyone pretty much suffers because of climate change, because of pollution, all that kind of stuff. Only incredibly wealthy people are able to purchase these suits that allow them to breathe clean air. So we follow a group of characters that are predominantly Southeast Asian as well as South Asian, if I remember correctly, and they've come up with this plan to kidnap the daughter of the man who creates and sells these really, really expensive suits. This book pretty much touches on 2 themes that I think Hollywood likes to tackle, which is class division and environmentalism, which is pretty prominent in this book. Again, sadly, this is probably the least popular book on this list, but I think a lot of people would enjoy seeing it on screen, if not just reading it. So there's one book on this list that I don't have a copy of, and that's because I read an ARC, and that is Mask of Mirrors by M.A. Carrick. So this book is a high fantasy, which I don't think typically would have been done before, but with the popularity of like Game of Thrones and The Witcher, I'm hoping that production companies would be more willing to do stuff like this. We follow two sisters, and they're both con women, but we follow one more than the other. The main character that we follow has pretty much came up with this really elaborate plan to get into the good graces of this very wealthy family. She's trying to pose as like a long lost cousin. She has a really good story to back her up. Unfortunately, she doesn't know, nor do like most of the comic people know, that this one particular family that she's trying to like infiltrate or con has kind of fallen out of like the good graces of their society. They're not as wealthy and they're not as respected. These wealthy families pretty much have that don't air your dirty laundry mentality. So while all the wealthy families know that this one wealthy family is not like super high up there in ranks anymore, so that's why our con artists going in are kind of blindsided by this realization. Despite that, our main character is still going in with a con, and because she's trying to be part of this family, she's also going to have to like participate in the political moves that this family has to do with the other families of this country state. I think it's more of like a city state, but she basically gets like into like all this political drama. There's also some kind of fantastical magical aspect of this series, and I want to say it mostly focuses like on tarot cards. They're not called tarot cards, but they're essentially tarot cards. Anyway, I don't remember the fantasy or the magic being like super like elaborate and all that kind of stuff, which I think would be really appealing to the Game of Thrones audiences that watch the show for like the political stuff and not necessarily the magical aspects, which were already like toned down for the show. The drama of this book is probably like my favorite, and I think would be really entertaining and thrilling for like majority audiences. We also have like vigilante character here. We also have like a kind of Darkling-esque character that's not overtly like evil like the Darkling, but kind of has that same audience appeal. I definitely think that this series, were it to be adapted, would have really good like social media presence, where like a lot of people would be talking about it like on Twitter, for example. That's just like what I'm imagining. There's only one book out so far. I'm not sure how long the series is supposed to be, but there's only one book out, and I like fell in love with it. But yeah, I forgot to mention, since I predominantly read fantasy, you're gonna see a lot of fantasy on this list. It's kind of like inevitable. Another series that I think would be a really good adaptation would be the His Fair Assassins trilogy by LaFevers. So this is technically like a teen YA book, but I definitely think the second book in the series in particular really like pushes the boundaries, because there's a lot of triggers, specifically sexual assault and incest. So this series takes place in the mid 1400s in Brittany, before it was like consolidated into France. Already like right off the bat, we have the appeal of this being like set in historical period, and also like it's pretty obvious that like the American film and television like industry has a borderline fetish with like film and television set in Europe, so it checks off those boxes. There's 3 books in the series. Each book follows a different young woman. All these women have something in common in that they are literally the daughters of their like patron saint of death. At the time, I'm not sure how popular Catholicism would have been in this part of Europe. However, in this series, it's not very popular, and people still kind of worship some like older deities, one of them being the Saint of Death. And the Saint of Death does regularly like have relationships with women, and they result into daughters, and these daughters are then taken to this I guess you can say an abbey, and they essentially train to become like his like death maidens, I guess you could say. So these death priestesses pretty much have like one job, and that is to like protect the interests of Brittany, to maintain their independence, to protect, in this case, the current reigning like ruler of Brittany, which is I think her name is Duchess Mary. Each book also features a romance, which sometimes when you watch like a film or a television series and you think, well, why did they have to like force in a romance? The industry sometimes thinks that if you have a romance, it appeals to like a larger audience. whatever. So the next books I'm going to talk about as one, and that's because they're from the same author, and that is literally anything by Karin Slaughter. I have The Good Daughter and Pretty Girls because I think those would be best adapted into a film or maybe a miniseries. Karin Slaughter writes really, really good mystery thrillers. Anything that I've read from Karin Slaughter tends to be pretty graphic and pretty dark. Literally any trigger warning that you can probably think of has come out in a handful of her books. So Pretty Girls is about two sisters who never really got over the disappearance of their oldest sister 20 years prior. However, one of the sisters' husband dies, and the death of her husband has some connection to the disappearance of her sister somehow. The Good Daughter is also about two sisters. She writes a lot of sisters. Both of these sisters went through a very traumatic home invasion when they were younger, and it really affected them mentally and physically. One of the sisters became a criminal lawyer like her father, and a separate traumatic event happens early on in the book, and she kind of becomes part of this thing that happens. I can't really go into detail without spoiling it, but it's pretty traumatic. She becomes involved in that, and that event also kind of somehow connects to the home invasion that she went through when she was younger. Again, Karin Slaughter likes to write these, like, this tragic event somehow connects to this tragic event in the past. She does that a lot, but both of the stories are pretty strong. Her standalones are probably my favorite. I've read some of her like books in a series. Those are also fine, but I think her standalones are really good. Mystery thrillers are already a pretty big genre, both in publishing and also film and television, but I think production companies would be more interested in seeing mystery thrillers from like a woman's perspective, or a woman or women as the main characters. I'm specifically thinking of the reception towards Sharp Objects and Big Little Lies, which were huge successes. I also think that more people want to see mystery thrillers where a police officer is not necessarily the main character. Police procedural shows are pretty popular as it is already, but I feel like they push a more kind of like not as dark type of genre. I'm thinking like Law and Order and Criminal Minds, where sometimes there's like dark topics, but for the most part the series itself is pretty lighthearted. I think people want a more like grim mystery thriller vibe, and with like how popular, for example, Gillian Flynn's books are, like Gone Girl and Sharp Objects, I think more people are really into like that flawed main character, that flawed women main character that we see a lot. I'm pretty sure at least one of Karin Slaughter's books has already been adapted into a film. I want to say it was like Pieces of Her or something like that. I do really enjoy these books. I know they might not be for everyone because they are incredibly graphic, but I think they're very thrilling and very entertaining. So those are all the books that I picked out for this video. I could have picked out more, but like the reason would have just been like, I really enjoyed these books, I want to see them adapted, which is fine. Again, that's fine, but I wanted to kind of give like my reasoning why these specific books would be like more worthy or more enticing for an adaptation. I hope that makes sense. Feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. What are some books you think would make a really good adaptation for film or television? I'd love to hear like anything you have to say in the comments down below. I will link all my socials down below, as well as some far more important links. Feel free to like, comment, or subscribe, or not. It's all cool with me. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Peace out.